Hello, I'm Esther Gitu-Ewart. It's Tuesday, June 21st. This is Africa 54.
Belgium hands over to the family of Patrice Lumumba a single tooth, the only known remains of the murdered Congolese independence hero. Forced to flee South Sudan due to conflict and violence, 3 former refugees are finding success in their new countries. We'll have a report. And in our wellness report, health correspondent Linord Moudou has the latest information on malaria and neglected tropical diseases which affect billions of people worldwide. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
The last known remains of Congolese independence hero Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister after attaining its independence, is now in the hands of his family members. David Doyle has the details.
Belgium returned a tooth, the last known remains of Congolese independence hero Patrice Lumumba, to his family on Monday. Lumumba was Democratic Republic of Congo's first democratically elected prime minister after independence from Belgium in 1960. But his government lasted just 3 months before he was overthrown and assassinated. Lumumba's supporters and some historians accused the CIA of ordering the killing. In 2002, a parliamentary investigation concluded Belgium was morally responsible for the death. Speaking at the Egmont Palace in Brussels on Monday, Lumumba's daughter, Juliana, addressed her comments to her father.
We have to admit that nothing can express what we are feeling today. We can only wish that wherever you are, you can be proud of your children, your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. Father, welcome back to the country. Thank you.
At the ceremony, a blue box containing Lumumba's tooth was handed over. It had been reportedly taken by a Belgian policeman who claimed to have dissolved much of the body in acid and burned the rest. Lumumba had alarmed the West with overtures to Moscow at the height of the Cold War. He also angered Belgium with a speech criticizing the colonization of his country, which included atrocities committed under the brutal rule of King Leopold II. Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo said the tooth had been returned much too late. He described the colonial period as a dark page in Belgium's history, echoing comments made by the country's King Philippe on a visit to Congo earlier in June. Congo's Prime Minister Jean-Michel Samalukonde called Lumumba a valiant fighter for democracy and a national hero. His death and the suppression of his supporters had hurt not only the victims' families, he said, but the country as a whole.
For more on this story, I'm joined live via Skype from Maryland by Ntal Alimasi, a governance and anti-corruption specialist and a native of DRC. Mr. Alimasi, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you.
The big question here is, why did it take Belgium so long to right the wrong? And what's the significance of Belgium's involvement now, 51 years after Lumumba's death?
Well, Esther, first of all, thank you for welcoming me and asking me to be part of this program. When it comes to the relationship between Belgium and the DRC, especially as far as Lumumba's life and death are concerned, Belgium has not really played, openly. even when the Prime Minister of Belgium says that this has been too long, there are still questions that are there. How did Lumumba die? Why? I mean, has there ever been any sort of justice made or called for his death, etc.? Especially when we know that he's the guy who basically took the teeth, because there were two that he has taken, was gloating on TV. I mean, saying, well, if ever as the people of the DRC wish, Lumumba to come back, when he comes back, he will be missing two teeth. There were fingers that were also taken. We don't know where they are. So in that manner, in terms of closure, we are glad that the family has got closure, but there's still that question which is there. What is Belgium hiding, and what are going to do in this particular situation in terms of bringing reconciliation, because the people are hurting.
And what is the reaction of the Congolese people so far?
So far, the Congolese people have mixed feelings. They are glad for the family. The family finally can really do what African tradition calls for, bury their father or grandfather and the great-grandfather. But at the same time, the Congolese are asking themselves, who is going to foot the bill for all these ceremonies? It's going to take, 8 days. Will Belgium foot the bill? Is the DRC government doing that? And in the end, if the DRC government is doing that, people are wondering, in a country really that poor, what are the priorities for all this expenditure?
And briefly, what is the proposed date for this symbolic burial?
On the 30th of June, so the day of the independence, and this will be done at the parliament, and then they will take him to the place that has always been called the Exchanger, in French, Échangeur de Limité, where his statue is, and that's where they propose to bury him.
Mr. Ntao, thank you very much for your insight. Ntao Alimasi is a governance and anti-corruption specialist and a native of DRC. The Economic Community of West African States has deployed troops to Guinea-Bissau to help stabilize the country after a failed coup in June, according to Reuters. Guinea-Bissau's government says that attackers in that coup attempted or intended to assassinate President Umaro Sissoco Embalo and were part of a well-funded and tightly planned plot. The government says 11 people were killed in the attack, including 7 members of the security forces who saved President Embalo and his prime minister from death. ECOWAS deployed a similar mission to the country from 2012 to 2020 after a coup to help deter the military from intervening in politics and protect political leaders. The United Nations Refugee Agency says the number of people worldwide who were forced to flee conflict, violence, human rights violations and persecution now tops 100 million for the first time. VOA's John Tanza reports.
3 former South Sudanese refugees who fled their countries to the United States, Uganda and Australia are doing well in their careers in their second home. Bishop Anthony Pogo, the current advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was a refugee in Uganda at the age of 1. Pogo was elevated last week to the position of Secretary General of the Anglican Communion. In an exclusive interview, Pogo says refugees should remain hopeful and work hard.
I think hard work is an important aspect, but also having hope. And it's important that you have hope. Whatever you do, remember that there is a better tomorrow.
The Anglican Communion Secretary General designate took a direct aim at leaders in Africa, including those in his country, to work for peace. He says the vicious cycle of violence in South Sudan and the DRC has displaced millions of people who are seeking refuge in Uganda and other parts of Africa.
As a former refugee, I would like to give you this opportunity to speak directly
on the camera to people who are in refugee camps today who could be watching this interview, what would you tell them?
Do what you can to help our people to go back to their countries of origin so that where there are conflicts, work for peace, work for reconciliation, work to prevent conflicts, not only intertribal conflict, but conflict between countries, conflict between different groups of people. Because part of what's contributing to all these conflicts is disagreement.
Another South Sudanese Australian featured in a new science fiction movie titled Spearhead, released last week and is now on the streaming giant Netflix, was once a refugee in Kenya at the age of 6 months. Stephen Petia Tongun says his parents and siblings were given an Australian humanitarian resettlement visa in 2000. Looking at your journey from South Sudan to Kenya and Australia, give us a little bit of synopsis of how you made it in Australia.
Look, for me, I've always been juggling these two things. Education was very important for not only my family, but for me as well in terms of creating the opportunities that I have now. I think if it wasn't for the fact that I had very driven parents that, insisted on us getting an education and really focusing on our success in terms of, having an occupation and focusing on something that we could also give back to our community.
Tangon, who is also a lawyer and actor, says the plight of refugees around the world requires urgent action to help people escaping conflicts in their countries of origin. He says refugees should remain hopeful and grab every opportunity that comes their way.
What I would like to say is really being a refugee, it doesn't end just because you've been given the humanitarian visa or whatever it is. In fact, the journey really just begins. There's a lot of issues that you have to face. Firstly, you're settling in an environment where you might not know anyone. And I really want to thank those people that take the time to also help refugees when they actually arrive in different countries.
Pogo and Tongun all attributed their successes to their parents, who gave them the opportunity to study and become career professionals.
For VOA listeners in Africa, John Tanza is an accomplished journalist, host and managing editor of VOA's South Sudan in Focus radio program. What many don't know is that John is a former refugee who spent years in Kenya's E4 Dadaab refugee camp. John joins me now live via Skype from Maryland to discuss his journey from a refugee to a journalist. John, welcome again to Africa 54.
Thanks, Esther.
Now, what circumstances led you to become a refugee? How old were you then?
Well, I will start with my age. I was around 27 years old, but the circumstances that forced me to become a refugee was basically the war in South Sudan. When I finished high school, there were no opportunities to go to the university. So I started venturing out from Juba to Khartoum to Egypt to Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo, and then I ended up in Kenya, where I went to Dadaab refugee camp.
And what was life like for you? Because one would want to know from a young age like that, and to be known to be, the top managing editor here for the South Sudan Focus program. How did that happen? How did you become a journalist, John?
Well, when I went to Dadaab refugee camp twice, trying to resettle in the United States, every time I go to the camp, the people who do the process are flying out of the camp. And when I travel back to Nairobi, they fly into the camp. So that was not my chance. So I decided to look for scholarship, to go for further studies. And thanks to the church, thanks to the Church Missionary Society, which is part of the Anglican Church, they gave me a scholarship to go to Daystar University, and I studied communication there for 4 years. After I finished, I was lucky, got hired in Nairobi on a USAID project, the first independent media for what was then Sudan. I worked there as a journalist and manager for 8 years. And then when we took the operation to Juba, which is today iRadio, VOA advertised a position for a senior reporter here, to work on what was then known as Sudan in Focus. And so I was interviewed and selected. That's how I ended up in the United States.
John, briefly, what's your message to that refugee who is looking up to you to say, I wish I could be like John? When can their breakthrough moment come? What do they have to do? What's your message, John?
I would just insist on this message that there is hope. When you come out of trouble, when you come out of conflict, there is hope at the end of the day if you work very hard. Nothing is given to you. You have to struggle to get what you want in life. Others are fortunate they have it, but there are some who are the majority who have to struggle. And the refugees fall in that category. You have to struggle for your future.
John, thank you so much for telling us your story. John Tanza is managing editor and host of VOA's South Sudan in Focus radio program. The United Nations says rival Libyan factions have failed to reach an agreement on constitutional amendments for elections. The UN Special Advisor on Libya, Stephanie Williams, says officials have wrapped up their third and final round of negotiations without an agreement on the measures governing the transitional period leading to the vote. Williams is calling for leaders of both chambers to meet within 10 days to try bridge the gaps. Oil-rich Libya, which has been engulfed in chaos for years since the ouster and death of Muammar Gaddafi, is once again at a political impasse, with two rival administrations claiming legitimacy. We would like to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Be sure to join us tomorrow for Paul Ndiho's Tech Report. Still to come, Health Correspondent Linord Moudou has the latest information on two diseases that affect billions of people. But first, Heidi Adams tells us what's coming up on Wednesday's Straight Talk Africa.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, 100 million people are forced to flee their homes and become refugees, making this the largest displacement crisis since World War II. Also in the show, I talk to Abebe Selassie, the director of the African Department of the International Monetary Fund, about the role of the IMF and its relationship with the African continent. Join me, Heidi Adams, and my guests on the next Straight Talk Africa.
In other news on the continent, Tunisian President Kais Saied confirms that Islam will stop being a state religion under the new constitution, which is to be submitted to a referendum on July 25th. A court in Somalia's Puntland state has sentenced 5 men to death for carrying out terror attacks for ISIS militants between 2017 and 2019. And Ethiopia has started repatriating its nationals from Middle Eastern countries, mainly in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Nearly 40,000 Ethiopians have returned home, over 12,000 of them originally migrated from Oromia region. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Africa is being held hostage in Ukraine's war with Russia, which is contributing to rising food prices on the continent. African countries are acutely affected by the growing crisis, which has sent prices of grain, cooking oil, fuel, and fertilizer soaring. Grace Oyenubi has more.
Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky has said Africa is being held hostage after Russia's invasion of his country contributed to rising food prices for the continent. Zelensky was addressing African Union leaders on Monday.
In an emergency for the whole world, when Africa is actually taken hostage of those who started the war against our state.
Russia and Ukraine account for nearly a third of global wheat supplies. Moscow has rejected accusations it is deliberately blocking grain exports from Ukraine. It claims global food and fuel price hikes have been caused by Western sanctions imposed after Russia began what it calls a special military operation. In early June, Senegal's President Macky Sall, who is also chairman of the African Union, said Vladimir Putin had told him Russia was ready to enable exports of Ukrainian grain. On Monday, Sall tweeted after Zelensky's speech that the continent remains committed to respecting international law, peacefully resolving conflicts and free trade. Grace Oyenubi, VOA News.
It's time for Health segment, and here's Africa 54 Health Correspondent Linord Moudou. Hello, Linord.
Hello, Esther. Well, Rwanda is set to host the Kigali Summit on Malaria and Neglected Tropical Diseases on Thursday. Both diseases affect billions of people worldwide. According to data from the World Health Organization, 23 countries have reached 3 consecutive years of zero malaria cases since 2000. 45 countries have eliminated at least one NTD, including Rwanda. For more insights, I spoke with Toko Elfik-Pule, Director of Uniting to Combat NTDs, a collective of partners working together to defeat 10 neglected tropical diseases. Take a look.
So although the diseases themselves are called neglected tropical diseases, it's actually the people that they affect that are neglected, because they affect the poorest amongst society. They affect 1.7 billion people on the planet and over 600 million on the African continent. So it's a huge burden on the African continent, really impacting our human capital. I call them the diseases of the unseen. People in some of the hardest to reach corners of the earth, people that live in very low resource settings. When you consider just how much can be done for these individuals, the simplicity of some of the interventions and the fact that some of these diseases themselves are preventable, there is actually no excuse that we're not doing anything.
What do you see as some of the major challenges now to combating NTDs?
I think one of the biggest challenges, obviously, is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. The crisis and the emergency and the nature of the response actually cost us more money than was necessary had we been prepared. And so that money has been diverted from elsewhere. So programs such as those for fighting neglected tropical diseases have suffered. Individuals that are affected by NTDs, in many cases, did not receive the treatment. Funding in some places was cancelled. The progress that was being made prior to COVID-19 is at huge risk if funding isn't quickly restored.
Rwanda is hosting the Global Summit on Malaria and Neglected Tropical Diseases. What is the significance of the summit toward the elimination of NTDs?
It's about putting efforts to fight neglected tropical diseases fairly and squarely in the countries that are affected by these diseases. And Rwanda is an excellent choice because it has actually demonstrated leadership in fighting neglected tropical diseases, having recently been validated by the World Health Organization for eliminating sleeping sickness, and has shown what can be achieved when countries take a leadership role. We are calling on countries that are affected by these neglected tropical diseases to neglect no more the individuals that are affected.
What can endemic countries do to push forward with or without the help of the international community? If one country can do it, perhaps others can do it as well.
It can be done because to date, 45 countries have eliminated at least one neglected tropical disease. And in addition to Rwanda, Togo recently eliminating blinding trachoma. Countries really need to make the fighting of neglected tropical diseases a matter of national priority.
So what should be expected from the Kigali Summit?
So countries really need to be looking at this and thinking, how do we use the fighting of neglected tropical diseases as an exemplar for not leaving anyone behind for the Sustainable Development Goals? It's about recognizing that there are already some bold commitments that countries have made for these diseases, for both malaria and neglected tropical diseases. identifying the practical steps that are needed to drive progress forward. Where do we need innovations? How do we need to integrate? How do we need to finance these interventions? We're very excited in the neglected tropical diseases community about the launch of the Kigali Declaration on Neglected Tropical Diseases, because it's about everybody coming together and saying, this is what I am going to do for the 1.7 billion people affected by NTDs.
While others are doing their part, meaning countries, donors, community, NGOs, what can citizens do?
We need citizens to say, enough is enough. We cannot, in the 21st century, have individuals with worms coming out of their legs due to guinea worm disease. 1.7 billion people is too big a number for people to be affected by diseases we know how to prevent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time.
And that's all for today. To stay in touch, find me on Twitter at Linord Moudou. Esther?
Thanks, Linord. Be sure to watch Linord Moudou's health reports every Tuesday on Africa 54. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.
Akampa nafasi kwamba arudi, kawa subhana tena ajirudi.
Ahora o que eu estou a recordar sobre o ataque e para a recordação que eu estou a ver sobre aqueles agentes
capturados com essas terroristas. Nunca, nem comunicação dela não tem.
Então, pus-me a faca dele aqui onde vocês estão a ver. Estão a ver este risco aqui. Pus-me. Cortou-me a primeira vez.
Nirimo rupi kwa na samarupe lehi kwa nirimo momobali rimo bubelia.